afternoon. Welcome to Sociology 1 at Yuba College. So we're picking up where we left off. We're still talking about conflict theory and what that's all about. And recall that to answer what conflict theory is all about, we're talking about what is capitalism. And to answer what is capitalism, we're looking at Karl Marx's ideas about what capitalism is. As we talked about, for Marx, capitalism is, first of all, a mode of production. It's a way of organizing how things are produced, by whom and where. And it's also a mode of exchange. It's a way of making sure goods get bought and sold in the society or exchanged. We were talking about the mode of exchange in capitalism as being a situation where people are able to take money and exchange it for a commodity. So the M stands for money, the C stands for something that you would buy with that, like wood. And then in capitalism, you can turn around and trade that for more money. Make sure you have this symbol here with this M, because it means that it's different than this. It's not equal, it's greater than that one. And we were asking, well, where did this extra come from? Where did this extra value come from? And as we started to discuss, it comes from what? What was the key way to adding value? If you buy a commodity like if you buy a commodity like lumber, what is the key that you need to add to the lumber to make it more valuable so that you could sell it for more? Labor. In other words, in all the examples you were able to come up with, like making something or transporting it somewhere or bundling it into smaller pieces and selling it, in all those cases you were adding something. You were adding work. But capitalists are people that don't generally do their own work. So the equation really looks like this. I take some money, let's say $10, and I buy some lumber with it. Then I buy commodity with it, lumber. Then I add labor, I add L to it. And then maybe I could sell it, I take $100, and then maybe I could sell it for $110. So if that's the case, if somebody will pay for a chair, they'll pay $110 for the chair that you made with $100 lumber. So they're paying $10 extra for something. What are they paying for? They're paying for the labor. They didn't want to make the chair, so they're paying you $10 to do that. They didn't want to take the lumber up to Quincy, so you brought it up there for them and you sold it to the people up in the mountains. They didn't want to buy a bunch of wood and bundle it into smaller things and store it. They just wanted $10 worth of wood, so you did all that and you sold it to them. So you're paying for the labor, but a capitalist doesn't pay for his labor. A capitalist doesn't do his own labor. He pays somebody else to do it. If you're a real capitalist, you didn't go make your chair or put your wood in your truck and carry it to Quincy. If you did all that, you would be what Marx calls an independent commodity producer. Somebody who buys some raw material, turns it into a thing like a chair, and you got paid for the work you did in doing that. But capitalists don't do that. Capitalists wear, really nice silk suits. And if you wear a really nice silk suit, you can't be getting sawdust on it, can you? That would ruin it. You can't be driving a greasy old truck up to the mountains with lumber in the back if you're wearing a nice silk suit. So how do capitalists do that? Well, you could go out into the parking lot of Home Depot, couldn't you? And find somebody out there that might work for you. Don't they still have guys out in the parking lot of Home Depot who you could hire to make a chair for you? Maybe they don't do that anymore. They used to call them day laborers. But anyway, there used to be these things called day laborers, guys that are out there in the street wanting to work for you. And I'm not trying to be racist, but let's say this guy's name is Pedro. And you say, Pedro, I just bought $100 worth of wood, and I want to make a chair out of it. Can you make a chair? And Pedro would say, Si, senor, I can make a chair. That's what I do. I'm a chair maker. Well, Pedro, will you come make a chair for me in my garage? And Pedro would say, well, see, I can do that, but how much, let's talk about money. Yes, Pedro, let's talk about your salary requirements. How much would Pedro take for adding $10 worth of value to your wood? What would he require? What would he demand? $10, unless Pedro is a really nice guy and he really likes you. But I think Pedro is a smart guy and knows how much his labor is valuable. So if you're asking him to add $10 to your wood, he's going to say, okay, senor, $10 for 2 hours work to go make your chair for you, sir. I'm going to need $10. So a capitalist has a problem here. I need to pay for my Armani suit that I just bought, my silk suit. I paid $100 for my wood, $10 for my labor. I can sell my chair for $110, but I didn't make any money. Where's my profit, right? So that's the big question for capitalism. How can I get Pedro to work for me and add $10 of value to my wood, but not get $10 in return for it? Or in other words, Marx is saying here something called, what Marx called the labor theory of value. And I don't have a real number for this. Let's just put it under mode of exchange. But it's a famous idea of Marx's called the labor theory of value, where he's saying all value comes from labor. All value comes from work, labor. Marx is arguing here with regular economics. If you take an economics class, anybody in here take Economics 101 or Economics 1? Nobody's taken economics class? You should take an economics class. They call it the dismal science, meaning it's boring. But anyway, sociology is more interesting. But anyway, economics says, what is the law of economics? If you haven't taken economics, maybe you don't know the law. But there's a famous law of economics that explains value, why some things are more valuable than other things. Do you know what that famous law of economics is? Supply and demand. The law of supply and demand. What does the law of supply and demand say? You just know the phrase? I think you know it. I think we all know it. The idea is if something is in low supply, if there's not much of something but people want it, in other words, if supply is low but demand is high, like a lot of people want the hot dogs at the baseball stadium. Hot dogs at a baseball stadium cost a little more than hot dogs at the store, right? Because there's a lot of people and there's nowhere else to buy hot dogs at the stadium, nowhere else to get food, so you buy it there because the demand is high, supply is low, so you'll pay $10 for a hot dog at the stadium, but you wouldn't pay that if you were going to Target or Costco to go shopping. So supply and demand. So what economists are saying is when something's in short supply but a lot of people want it, people will pay more for it. And that's why some things cost more than other things. Gold, for example, costs more because there's not a lot of gold and a lot of people want it, so gold is more valuable than silver. But Marx is arguing with that idea. Marx is saying here it's not really the fact that something is in low supply that makes it valuable. What really makes it valuable is the effort. The effort involved. Yes, gold is more valuable than silver, and it's rarer than silver, but what that means is gold is harder to find. It's harder to get. It requires more effort, and what people are really paying for when they pay more for something is the effort that some humans went through to either make that thing or get that thing. And so Marx says all value comes from labor. If you want there to be wealth, or if you want to add value to something, the only way to make it more valuable, in Marx's view, is to put more work into it. If you ask why does a doctor make more money than a bricklayer, Marx would say it's because it takes more labor to become a doctor. You have to spend longer time in school training and learning to be a doctor than a bricklayer, so it's a more valuable commodity, the labor of a doctor than the labor of a bricklayer. So even the value of labor is determined by how much labor went into the labor. But the point is, labor makes value, and if capitalists don't do their own labor, if they're buying labor, and if they're adding value to products and getting this extra value, then the question becomes, well, where did they get it? If they're not doing their own labor, and they're adding labor because they're adding value, then whose labor are they adding, and how are they able to make any profit off that? And Marx says when you begin to answer that question, you begin to see why capitalism isn't a very sustainable system. And Marx's name for this is surplus value. So now we're ready for another Roman numeral. where does surplus value come from? Maybe I need to switch pens. I'm already ready for my refills. Surplus value. So surplus again means extra. So where did this extra come from? If I'm going to pay a worker the value of their labor, if I've got to pay Pedro $10 for $10 worth of labor, then how do I get any profit? Because I paid $100 for the wood, I paid $10 for the labor, and the chairs, the consumer will pay $110 for it. I can't just say to the consumer, well, you got to pay $130. They don't want to do that. So somebody's got to give me my profit, but who's going to do it? And so we're really talking about profit here. Where does profit come in? If labor is what creates value, and capitalists don't labor, then where are they getting this thing called profit from? And Marx says there's two main ways that you can get workers to add more value to your product than you're paying them. So here's how you have to think about it. How could I get Pedro to give me $10 worth of labor, but me don't have to give Pedro $10? How could I do that?
Get the person who bought the lumber for to reduce the cost?
Well, so I've got to try to reduce my, if I could reduce my raw materials costs, yeah, but those tend to be fixed costs because, again, Home Depot doesn't need to sell me wood any cheaper than other people will buy it, and if people are going to pay $100 for that wood, why would Home Depot sell it to me for less? I could buy it in a huge amount of bulk, but I'm still buying it for the value that it is. Anyway, Marx says there's two main ways to try and get workers to give you more value. One is called absolute surplus value. And that simply means what he calls the prolongation of labor. What does it mean to prolong something? Nobody knows what the word prolong means? I'm sure you've learned the word prolong. Extended time. To prolong something is to make something go longer than it otherwise would, right? Are we in agreement on that? So what would it mean to prolong labor? What does it mean to make somebody work longer than they otherwise would? And here we've got to go back to feudal times. I know the lecture was last week. But remember when we talked about the Enclosure Acts and we talked about all these serfs that used to be independent commodity producers. They used to make their own chairs. And if you were a Pedro yourself with your own chair shop, buying your own wood, making your own chair, and selling your own chairs at the marketplace, then Marx would say you're an independent commodity producer. You're not paying somebody else to make your chairs. You're paying yourself for your labor. You're going to the marketplace and charging people $10 more than the cost of your wood because you're charging them for your labor in making it. And if they pay you $10, then that's $10 you get to keep. But if one day the sheriff comes and says, you don't get to have your chair shop anymore because we have this new thing called the Enclosure Act and somebody bought your land and you don't own this land, so goodbye, you need to get off of it, what can you do? Well, if you're Pedro, you put your family's belongings in your whatever's left to you in a wagon. And maybe you have some tools left from your chair shop. Maybe you have a wagon. Maybe you have your family and a horse. But you don't have a chair shop and you've got nowhere to make chairs. So what are you to do? And in those days, what people did was go to the city. And if you go to the city, what you will see there is big factories. And these are new things you've never seen before because there never was such a thing as a factory. Because back in feudal times, you had independent commodity producers and independent shops all over the countryside. But now the production is taking place in a big city like London, and the merchants now own the land and own the factories, and they have set up a thing called a chair factory. And if I'm Pedro with my family, I walk into London, and I see in London this big thing called chair factory. And it sounds familiar because I know what a chair is. I make chairs. And standing outside the chair factory is a guy in a very nice suit, a capitalist who owns the chair factory. So let's pretend you're Pedro. Can you be my Pedro? And I'll be the capitalist. Hey, Pedro. Nice to see you. Hey, it's really bad what they did to you up there with the Enclosure Acts. They forced you off your land, and you got a beautiful family there, and now you're on the streets, I guess. You have nowhere to live, nowhere to make any money. But I got good news for you, Pedro. I got a chair factory right here. You know what a chair factory is? Yes. It's a place where we make chairs. And you make chairs. So we're looking for guys just like you to come help us make chairs in Flack's Chair Factory. So what do you say? You want to come work for me?
Sure.
No, don't shake yet, Pedro. We haven't talked turkey yet. We got to talk turkey. We need to talk about your salary requirements. We need to talk about that. So don't agree to anything until we really talk brass tacks, right? Okay? So Pedro, let's talk about your salary requirements. How much money were you making up there in the rural village where you lived with your chair shop? And Pedro thinks about it a little bit and says, well, let's see. I woke up every day about 9 o'clock. I got to my chair shop around 10 o'clock. I worked for about 4 hours. Around 2 o'clock, I would go to the marketplace. I would always sell my chairs within about an hour. I always sold about 2 chairs a day. I made about $5 per chair. So Pedro says, about $10 I made a day. And after that, after the marketplace, I'd go fishing, and then I would go to the pub and have a pint, and then I'd go home. Oh, sorry, I'm reminiscing. Pedro, I don't need to hear about your whole life, but yeah, $10, you were getting $10 a day. So $10 a day. Is that your salary requirement, Pedro?
Yes.
So you want to come work for me? I'll pay you $10 a day. You just got to make chairs here instead of where you are. And you can take that $10 you make, you can get an apartment. We have apartments here in London. Your family will have a place to live. We have markets. You can go buy food there. It'll be a lot like the village, only you'll be here in London. There's more to do here. What do you think? You down with it?
Yes.
Okay, Pedro, we'll see you here tomorrow at 4 in the morning. There was one thing we didn't discuss. What didn't we discuss? What is a day?
Work hours.
What is a work day? When Pedro was in charge of his own work day, when he was an independent commodity producer, he was in charge of his day, and he woke up at a reasonable time, like 9. That's reasonable to me. He didn't really work until like 10 o'clock. He worked about 4 or 5 hours in the day. He went to the marketplace and sold his chairs and got his money, and he had a lot of time left over in the day for other things that Pedro likes to do. In this new regime, he still gets the $10, but what does he have to do? When does he leave? You're going to get there, I said 4 in the morning. Let's say 6 in the morning. But you're going to leave when? 10 tonight. So I'll see you at 6 in the morning, you'll leave 10 tomorrow night. So his work day just got a lot longer than it used to be. And that's a big difference between being an independent commodity producer in feudal times and being a worker in early capitalism is suddenly you're working 16 hours a day. That's what a normal work day is. So we can say prolongation of labor, prolonged compared to what? Well, compared to what normal people would want to work. If they were in charge of their own work and their own survival, most people probably don't want to spend 16 hours a day working. They probably want to spend less than that and have other time for other things. So capitalism says, well, we'll still give you your $10, but you need to work longer than you need for yourself. You need $10 for your food and your apartment and your kids. But I need $10. In fact, I need like $20, $30 for your labor. So you work for 10 hours, you work for $10. In the first 2 hours, like by 8 in the morning, you'll have made $10. But we're not going to give that to you yet. We're just going to tack it up here on the bulletin board. And you keep working after 8 o'clock until 10 at night tonight. And all those other hours you're working, those belong to me. That's how I can get Armani suits and nice cars. So you shouldn't have been a chairmaker, Pedro. You should have been a capitalist. Anyway, so the point is prolongation of labor is a very profitable thing for the capitalist because he's making a lot of money, making a lot more than the worker is. But do you see any limits to that way of doing things? What kinds of problems might you run into if you're a capitalist trying to work people 16 hours a day?
Workers ain't gonna like it.
Not going to like it. Well, what if all the other companies and factories in London also have a 16-hour workday? There's not much they can say about it because if you want a job and you want to eat, you go work for a capitalist, and that's how long they want you to work for you to get paid by them. So they might not like it, but why is that a limit to me as a capitalist? Huh? Well, that turns out to be a problem. If you don't pay workers enough money, then you have a lot of products being made, but not a lot of people buying them, and that turns out to be a problem for capitalism. But more immediately than that, what is a problem with working 16 hours a day? Well, still slow down. People can't really work that much. That's an inhuman amount of time to be working. Can you prolong it even more? I mean, you could give incentives to people. If you make this many chairs, I'll pay you this much, but that might not really work out too well. What ends up happening is workers start fighting against this and saying, well, we can't live like this. We just had Labor Day. Where did we get Labor Day from? Well, unions and labor organizations of workers coming together saying, you can't just do this to us as individuals. If we become a union, we're going to have more power against you than we have as just individual Pedros trying to get a better wage. If Pedro tries to say, no, I need $20 an hour, the guy would be like, bye-bye, I'll go talk to somebody that doesn't want that. But if we all go in as a group and say $20 is better than 10, we're not working. None of these people in London are working till you give us $20 an hour. Then you can maybe get a wage raise. So the labor movement is really what protested against this. Originally, they hired a lot of children to work 16 hours a day, and children do die. I mean, one limit to this is the human body can't work 16 hours a day, day after day, without getting sick and dying. And that was one reason they hired children, is children, when they get sick and die, if they're orphans, hey, nobody cares. And you just hire somebody else. And kids can work longer and faster in some cases. And so, but the labor movement got together and said, no child labor, you can't hire people that young. And also they fought and said, we want a better working day. The 12-hour working day was the first victory for workers. When they got the law changed in London to say, if you work us more than 12 hours, you're demanding too much. Then they fought for the 10-hour day. When they got that, they said, yay, we can finally live. And then in America, it was American workers that demanded the 8-hour day and saying we want 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, and 8 hours for what we will, meaning 8 hours to have leisure. We want to be able to live, not just work and sleep. And so the 8-hour day has become the standard working day, but still Americans work more than most people around the world. We work what's called a 40-hour work week. To be considered a full-time worker in America, you're supposed to work 5 days at 8 hours a day. But in much of Europe, 35 hours a week is considered a full-time job. In some cases, it's 28 hours a week. So in Europe, you can be considered a full-time job and get full-time pay, sometimes for working more like 30 hours a week. Here, we work 40 and 50. And a law was just passed here in California that said farm workers, too, people who work in fields picking, should also get overtime if they're being asked to work more than 8 hours a day. They should get paid time and a half or sometimes double. A lot of farmers said, we don't like that idea. You know, farming isn't the same as other jobs. But basically, American workers have said, you know, if you want to hire us, you better pay us a wage we can live on, not one that's just going to make us be starving and sick all the time. But anyway, we're going to talk more about that. So it's not really possible anymore. Is it possible to work people 16 hours a day anymore? Not really. There are things called sweatshops. Sweatshops nowadays do exist, but they're illegal. And sometimes in places like in LA, you have illegal immigrants, not so much from Mexico, but China. And in China, if people come over here, they have to pay some guy to bring them over, and they don't always have the money. So then the guy will say, well, you owe me $10,000 now, because I brought you to America. And now you've got to work in the sweatshop, basically work all day long, every day for nothing to pay off your debt. So there are these illegal sweatshops. And in China itself, there are still factories that work people, 6-7 days a week for more than 10 hours a day, and that's considered just a normal working day. But here in America, it's not legal to do this anymore, and most companies aren't able to do it. And there's actually a better way to get profit. The second way to get extra value out of your workers, Marx calls relative surplus value. This is called absolute because every hour you work more is more profit for the company. So having workers work 14 hours is better than 12, and 16 is even better than 14. But relative surplus value is the question of intensification of labor. Instead of making people work longer hours, the idea is to make them more productive in less time. So the question now becomes, how can I get the same amount of chairs from Pedro, but instead of working him 16 hours a day, I'm going to only work Pedro 8 hours because the law got changed, and I can only work him 8 hours. But I want to be able to have him produce as many chairs as he was before in 8 hours now instead of 16, or maybe even more chairs than he made before in 8 hours. So how can I get people to be more productive in less time? What do you think the main goal would be there? If I owned a chair factory, if I'm Flax Chair Factory and you guys are my workers, how can I make sure that Now that I can only work you half the time I was working you before, it used to be you had to get here at 6 in the morning. Well, they changed the law, guys. I got good news for you now. You only have to get here at 8 o'clock, and I can only keep you till about 5 today with the breaks. So you've got a lot less time here at the factory than you did before. But how am I going to do that? So maybe I'll give bonuses to the fastest chair makers here. But won't I reach a limit? Isn't there a limit that the human body reaches? Like maybe Pedro could make 5 chairs a day. Maybe there's a really fast guy out there that can make 7 chairs a day. But I'd like to get up to like 15 chairs a day. And I might get to a point where there's no incentive that can work because people just can't work that quickly. So how could I get to 15 chairs a day even though the human body is incapable of making 15 chairs a day per person? Machines. That's the key idea here. To intensify people's labor, you can't just ask them to work harder because they're going to come up against limits that the human body can't go past. And so don't just use humans. The main way to intensify labor, it's a series of things that I'm going to call scientific management. And one of the key ideas of scientific management is machines. Mechanization, it's called. If you can give Pedro an electric lathe that spins chair legs, if you try to spin chair legs and use a sander to do it, it's going to take you a lot of time to get that hunk of wood down into a nice, smooth, round chair leg. But if you have an electric lathe, you just put that chunk of wood in there, zzz, you got a chair leg. So machines are a very nice way to speed people up, and we refer to that as mechanization. But even more than that, what you need are what are called time motion studies. You want to figure out all the motions that are required to produce a product. And you want to figure out how much time each motion takes. And you as a manager want to figure out all the seconds I can shave off of that time. I want to reduce the amount of motions the workers take, and I want to reduce the amount of time each motion takes. And so what's a good way to reduce the amount of motions a worker has to make? Like if you're working on building car, or if you're working on building chairs, Pedro has a lot of motions to make. He's got to cut the wood. He's got to join the wood. He's got to sand the wood. He's got to shellac the wood. That's a lot of different steps, and each step has a lot of different tasks. Could I rearrange things so that Pedro is much quicker on each of those tasks?
Specialized so that each worker does one of the tasks.
Exactly. So what you really want is what's called an assembly line. You want to break up the task into separate pieces and make each piece a job. So that each guy doing that piece of the task, he's a really specialized guy that just focuses on that one thing. Pedro is a skilled chair maker. He knows how to make all the parts of the chair and all the processes. But skilled chair makers cost a lot of money because they know what they're doing, and their labor is more valuable because they've invested more labor in their own expertise. So a chair company, a chair factory, doesn't want to have to hire Pedro because Pedro is a skilled chair maker. So if I can break up the process into smaller pieces, and each piece can be really easy to do and really fast to do, well, that's referred to as de-skilling. If I take the skill out of it, then I can hire any person off the street to come work on my chair. And so factories are places where the chair making process is broken up into a bunch of simple tasks, like you just cut wood, you just join wood, you just sand wood, you just put shellac on. And if all I do is put shellac on wood all day long, I'm going to become really fast at putting shellac on wood, faster than Pedro ever could. And if all those pieces are broken up and there's a conveyor belt carrying things from each station to each station, well, that means the worker doesn't have to turn and walk and go to the next station. And that turning and walking, that was like half a second where you weren't working. So you don't want people walking and doing things like that. You want them working constantly. So put each worker at a station, have them working constantly, have the conveyor belt carry things from each station to each station, and you've got a much more mechanized system where the worker isn't very skilled. The other thing is now you can fire Pedro. Sorry, you were a skilled chair maker. Now I'm just going to hire some poor kid off the street, or now it's not kids maybe, but some very unskilled person that only wants the minimum wage to, learn to shellac. And I can teach him that in 5 minutes. And he's going to get really good at it too. And so, but that's also a very good tactic of the capitalist class, is if all the capitalists are the ones that are smart people that know how to run factories and manage factories, and all the working people are basically de-skilled people that don't know how to do anything. They only know how to do the things that factories taught them how to do. Then they're very easily controlled as a class, and you can really scare them into saying, well, you need us more than we need you, because we can hire anybody to do your job, but who's going to hire you? We hire you. So the working class becomes when workers were skilled, independent commodity producers, they were much less controlled by the nobility. I mean, then they could tell the nobility a little more what to do. But nowadays, we workers are in many ways at the mercy of capitalists. And if capitalists won't invest and build a factory in our community, then we don't have a job, and there's nothing we can do, and we are, face death. So there's a number of benefits here for a capitalist in that you are de-skilling workers, you're breaking up things, you're making it possible to hire and replace workers. So if I'm the manager of Flax Chair Factory, I'm going to come to you guys and I'm going to say, I got good news for you guys. The good news is this: we put our main competitor out of business. Acme Chair Company is across town. They're our main competitor. They make chairs too. But we just put them out of business because I just invested a bunch of money in the factory. And so I bought a bunch of machines. And we're going to start making chairs a lot quicker than Acme. Acme hasn't gone out of business yet, but they will, trust me. So it's good news that we're going to put Acme out of business. But the bad news for some of you is I don't need half of you anymore. We've got machines replacing you. So this half of the room, you're out of a job. Bye-bye. This half of the room, you're going to be working and making these chairs for me in Chair Factory. So anyway, this is the two types of surplus value. And Marx says this one is the one most companies use nowadays. Only in really backward, poor countries like Bangladesh, maybe, do people still use this. But in advanced capitalist countries like ours, this is the method that most companies use. And according to Marx, this method of getting profit leads to the main problem with capitalism, which is the polarization of society. And so let's talk about polarization now. So our fourth Roman numeral, which blue works, is polarization. No. Polarization. Can you see that? Is it too light, or should I switch to this? Oh well, you guys aren't talking to me, so I'll just go on. But you need to, like workers, if workers are going to be treated well, they have to make their voices heard. And the same thing's with students. If you just sit there and I'm writing and you can't see it and you don't say anything, well, that's going to be your problem, not mine. But anyway, polarization. So we talked about, I wish I had a better pen here. I can't see it myself, so I know you can't. Let me get on here real quick. Okay, I'm just going to draw it on this thing now, if you don't mind. So we're on number 4, polarization. Remember, this was Marx's prognosis for where capitalism was headed. It's that splitting apart of society into two poles. And these two poles are, on the one hand, the capitalists. And on the other hand, the workers. And we just talked about relative surplus value, this tendency to replace workers with machines and to have people work, less time for less money. What happens is capitalists compete. That's one thing that happens. And that's what I was just describing to you. As capitalists compete, some capitalists don't get to be capitalists anymore. And some workers don't get to be workers anymore. If we were the flax chair company, and we put in a bunch of machines in our factory, and the chair factory across town, Acme, didn't invest in putting in machines, well, what's going to happen? Well, for one thing, I'm going to lose half my workforce because I don't need you anymore. So I just fired a bunch of people. That means we now have a bunch of people that are out of work. One thing that happens when capitalists compete is some workers lose their jobs. And they end up in something down here that Marx called the lumpen proletariat, or the industrial reserve army. These are people that don't work right now. They're like reservists that aren't fighting in the war yet, but they might get called up to fight in the war if they're needed. And it's the same way here. If you used to work in a factory like Flax Chair Factory and you're laid off, you're told one day, we don't need you anymore because we've got machines now. Well, now you're out there on the street trying to find a job. And some capitalists are not capitalists anymore. They fell out. So I'm drawing these little lines where people are falling out of their class. I'm going to come to you in a few months after we invested the money in the machines. And I'm going to say, I got good news for you guys workers, really good news. Acme Chair Company, they went belly up. They're out of business. So we are the only chair maker in town, and that's really good news. So can we get a round of applause? You guys are hard workers. Yeah, there's even some other good news. I'm going to cut your salary in half. Are you? You should clap for that. Aren't you happy that I'm cutting your salary in half? You should be. You know why? Do you see those faces pressed up against the windows here of Flax Chair Factory? You know whose faces those are? Who's looking in here at you guys? Huh? The workers from Acme. They lost their jobs completely. And they came over here this morning before you guys got here, and they said they wanted to do your jobs for a quarter of what you guys are doing it for. And I said, I can't do that to my loyal workers. They helped me put you guys out of business. I'm not going to fire them. But, you know, I am going to have to cut your salary. So we'll see you guys here tomorrow, okay? All right. Acme. I got to go play golf. In other words, so what happened there was capitalists competed, but what that meant is some capitalists now they're out there looking for jobs. Some workers, not only the workers that got laid off because of my machines, but some of the workers at Acme are now out there looking for a job. And that means workers compete as well. Workers are competing for wages. And Acme said they would do it for less. That means your wages went down. So what happened here? Well, the capitalist class just got smaller. There's fewer factory owners out there because those investors over there just lost their shirts. And now they need a job. And there's more workers now because they just joined the working class. So now we got more people working, but only some of them are actually working. And a lot of them aren't working at all. And that means these ones don't make as much money as they used to. They're making less money. And me up here, if I'm a capitalist, well, I'm making more and more money because not only did I just lower my labor costs, because I cut your guys' salary in half, what else can I do now that Acme's out of business that will increase my profit margin? So your profit margin is the distance between the price you're getting for the product and your cost in making it. Well, my labor cost just went down. What else could I do to increase my margin?
Raise the price.
I can raise my price now because my competition just went belly up. And so Flax Chair Company can raise its price for the chairs, but we're not going to kick down any more money to our workers. In fact, we're kicking down less to them. So they're making less, but I'm making more. And so over time, according to Marx, capitalism inevitably leads to a situation where there's going to be fewer and fewer producers, fewer and fewer capitalists owning more and more of the factories and more of the land, with more and more of the wealth, and more people that don't own things that are able to command less and less in terms of wages from the people who do own things. And that polarization into have and have-nots, well, right now, we're looking at that in our world today. Many people have commented on the extreme polarization and inequality of America today and the world today. I'm sure you've heard of the concern about the 1%. The 1% in the world today owns a lot more of the wealth than they used to. And the 99%, which is most of the rest of us, has a lot less of the wealth than we used to. So America used to be a more equal society where the people who were haves were more numerous and the people who were have-nots were less numerous, and they were closer together in terms of how much money they had and wealth. Now the have-nots are far below the haves, and there's many more of them, and there's this much smaller group of haves that has way more than haves used to have. And so that's what's called polarization or inequality. Our president said it was the number one problem facing the country. Bill Gates, who's a capitalist himself, said it's the number one problem facing the world today. And so all around the world, people are saying, you can't really have a very happy, healthy society when 1% of it is doing really well, much better than they need to be, and masses of people aren't doing well enough. In fact, NASA, the space agency, the guys that are the rocket scientists that put a man on the moon and all the other, they just released a study about what are the causes of civilization collapse, like when the Roman Empire collapsed and other civilizations when they've collapsed. One of the main factors is inequality. If you have too much wealth in too few hands at the top and too many people with not enough, you got a real problem on your hands. Well, Marx said that problem would lead to the collapse of capitalism, that this mass of have-nots would eventually look at this group of haves and say, well, you guys are the problem. All we need to do is take you guys out and redistribute this wealth and redistribute ownership. And if more workers own more of the factories or were in charge of them, they'd pay themselves better and work each other less and give each other more opportunity to develop their skills. And that's what he meant by the fifth mode of production. Marx thought capitalism, this polarization, would eventually lead to, modern communism, which we already talked about. But that didn't happen, has it? The whole worldwide working class has not risen up against capitalism and overthrown the capitalists. In fact, the opposite so far seems to have happened. Russia was a country that for a while said it was a communist country, but they no longer do. They say they're basically a kind of capitalist country. China still likes to say it's run by the Communist Party. The people who run China call themselves communists, but everything that country does is what capitalist countries do. They invest in factories and pay people low wages to make profit. And so they are really a capitalist country. Cuba was a communist country, they said, but they're not anymore. So if anything, the world is becoming more of a capitalist place, not less of one. But at the same time, some of the things Marx predicted for capitalism came true, or are coming true. So we have to ask, well, what saved capitalism? Because according to Marx, capitalism should have collapsed. By now, workers should have joined together and overthrown the system. And so I'm phrasing this as a question. Why didn't this worldwide workers' revolution against capitalism happen? And to answer that, we need to go back in history again, back to the Great Depression. And I'm going to put the Great Depression in parentheses here because the Great Depression didn't save capitalism. The Great Depression almost killed capitalism. And when the Great Depression happened, a lot of people began to look at Karl Marx's writings again and say, maybe this guy knew what he was talking about because everything he said would happen to capitalism is now happening. What was the Great Depression and when was it? Well, you probably know about 1929 and the stock market crash. I'm not going to talk about the stock market crash really because that doesn't really matter to what we're talking about because that might have been the beginning of it. But what it really amounted to was at one point there was 25% unemployment. That's a huge amount of people without jobs. We had a recession, a big recession here back in 2008 for a couple of years. And at that time, Yuba County actually at one point had the worst unemployment of like the whole country. And do you remember what the highest it was in Yuba County was? I think the highest it got to was 20%. And that was the worst in the country. So imagine the entire country being at a level of 25% unemployment. That means 1/4 of people that need work don't have it at all. And so you had a lot of poverty going on. And why did this happen? From a sociological standpoint, we would say it had to do with what's called a overproduction / under consumption crisis. Overproduction / underconsumption crisis. Well, what happens if a factory overproduces? What does that mean? Well, let's say we were the Flax Chair Company, and one day I come to you as the manager and say, well, we got a problem, guys. We've got a lot of inventory, a lot of unsold inventory is what it's called. We've got a lot of chairs out there that we've made that are sitting on the shelves at all the retailers in town. But they're not selling. They're just sitting there on the shelves at the retailers. So what do you think I'm going to need to do as your manager? I mean, I'm actually asking for your help as my workers because I don't know what to do. What should I do? What would help save the company here?
Lower your prices.
I could try lowering my prices, and we did do that. All those stores put their stuff on sale. And they said, we had a fire sale. We, in fact, lowered it to at cost. We were selling our chairs at the price you guys, the factory gave it to you, and people still wouldn't buy them. So now if we want to sell them, it's going to have to be like under cost. You're going to have to give us money. The factory's going to have to send money to the retailer for them to be able to sell it. And we don't want to do that. That's just going to lose more money. So that's not going to save it.
Expand our product.
Well, we could diversify maybe, but we're a chair company. We're only geared to make chairs here. You're talking about investing money we don't have to expand in ways we can't expand right now. But we need a more immediate solution to our problem.
Buy one get one free.
Well, like you say, we can keep lowering the price, but at a certain point, it's going to cost us money, not make us any money. So the main thing I'm going to have to do is lay some of you off. I can't keep hiring you because I'm not getting revenue in. And you're going to want pay next month. And if I don't have revenue coming in now, I can't pay you at the end of the month. So I'm sorry. I'm going to have to let you go until the economy improves. I'm laying you off. So that's what happened. That's why this overproduction, underconsumption crisis happened. It's like a vicious cycle. A lot of people lost their jobs because of the stock market crash. But once people lost their jobs, people weren't buying stuff at the store. And when people aren't buying stuff at the store, then more people lose their jobs. And when more people lose their jobs, they're not buying stuff at the store. And when they're not buying stuff at the store, more people lose their jobs. So it's a collapse. It's a vicious cycle where it got worse and worse. And I'm not going to write all that down, but hopefully you see that if products aren't selling, then workers get fired. And if workers get fired, even fewer products sell. To the point where you ended up with 25% unemployment, and a lot of businesses failed. And you didn't, by the way, have in those days what we now call a social safety net. There wasn't unemployment insurance for people to get, or welfare for people to go on, or other things like that. So it was a real serious problem for America at the time. And that looked like Marx was right. Society was polarizing. Huge numbers of people were have-nots with no way to live. A small number of people still got to be haves. Another thing Marx predicted was that America might be the place where this worker revolution might happen, that American workers were able to read more than most workers were around the world. And American workers actually had the right to vote, which not every worker did around the world. So Marx actually predicted maybe American workers would be the ones to come together, form political organizations like political parties, and start voting people into office like the President of the United States, who would be workers rather than capitalists. And there was a guy named Eugene V. Debs, I'll mention. Eugene V. Debs wasn't alive during the Depression, but he ran for president in the 20s and earlier, well, in 1912. And he was a socialist. He was a member of the Socialist Party. And the Socialist Party, that's another word really for communism. When we say Marx was a Communist Party member, well, socialism and communism are very similar terms. And so when Eugene V. Debs ran for president of the United States as a socialist, and he got 1 million votes in 1912, well, that's part of this wake-up call that capitalism was having, of realizing not only do we have a tendency to polarize, where we end up with lots of unemployed people, but we also sometimes have a lot of angry workers who might vote into office people that aren't capitalists, that don't like capitalism. And by the way, you saw the same thing happen this year in America. A socialist ran for president. Bernie Sanders calls himself a socialist. And a lot of Americans who've been raised to think of socialism as a dirty word, as a bad thing, were in favor of the guy. And so that's part of what Marx meant by when lots of people find that the capitalist system isn't working for them, they're not getting better off, they're not getting ahead anyway, they start saying, well, why is this a good system? It only benefits a few people. So Marx figured, and so that's what it looked like was happening during the Great Depression, that the capitalist system wasn't working for most people, and that many people were turning against it. So if you were a capitalist at the time, and who was a capitalist at the time? Well, one of the famous people was Henry Ford, who started Ford Motor Company. He liked capitalism, he liked his capitalist company, but he could see that Marx is right about certain things, that we need to change capitalism if we want it to be sustainable, if we want to save it. So one thing that saved capitalism is Fordism. Henry Ford is the founder of this idea. And he owned the Ford Motor Company when all this was going on. And but even before that, even before the Great Depression, what he started to do was say, I'm going to pay my workers a lot better than other car makers are paying. He made cars, and in the car industry back then, you made about $1 a day, most workers did. And Ford announced one day, I'm going to pay workers $5 a day. And so all his competitors said, old man Ford's gone crazy. He's paying people 5 times what the industry pays. He's not going to be able to survive. He said, but I'm going to do something else. I'm going to make cars so cheap that workers making $5 a day can afford them. Because Ford basically said, you know, guys like Karl Marx are right, that the capitalist system is not a fair system. If I'm exploited all day making no money, and at the end, and I'm working all day on a product that I myself could never hope to afford. Marx said that's alienation. If I have to sit there making a car for somebody, and that car makes that guy look great and makes him respected and makes him feel great, and it makes me feel like a loser and a nothing, then that sucks, working all day on something that's a symbol for somebody else that symbolizes how poor I am. And so Ford said, yeah, why would workers want to live in a system where they have to make stuff that other people get to have and make and get rich off of, and the worker just works and doesn't get anything. So Ford said, that isn't right. And so Ford said, a better system would be one where the guy working on the car all day is also the guy that gets to buy that car and drive the car off the lot and drive home in the Ford that he helped make. That would be a better capitalist system than one where the workers, and by the way, cars in those days were only for the richest people. They were like yachts are today. I mean, if you had millions of dollars, you could buy a car. But most people couldn't. And so Ford said what we really need to do is combine mass production. Yes, we need to make a lot of stuff. That's what capitalism is good at. When you use factories with machines and descaling, you can produce a lot of stuff. But mass production is not going to work for a system as a system unless you also have mass consumption. This really should be 2 words. Mass production and mass consumption. You have to have the workers be the ones consuming the products that workers make, and that's a more sustainable system. If workers work all day at a job they don't like, but they're able to come home and enjoy the products that capitalism makes. If they can come home and have a TV and a radio and a dishwasher, and if they can go to places like Disneyland and Magic Mountain and go see movies and stuff like that, well, then capitalism might be a lot more of a pleasant system to be in if you actually can consume the things that capitalism makes. And so the big change to capitalism in the 1930s in America was to say, let's become more of a consumer society. And to do that, you had to train people. You had to stimulate what's called consumerism. Most people in those days didn't want to go spend their money. If you made money at a job, you wanted to save it. You wanted to make sure you had money for a rainy day or for things you really need. My grandparents were people that grew up before the Great Depression, and they were adults when the Great Depression happened. And they were people who their whole lives never wanted to spend money. Even late in life when they had quite a bit of it, I would say, like, we'd say, Grandma, it's your birthday. I want to take you out to eat. Let's go out to eat on your birthday. And she would say, but I have a meatloaf in the freezer. Let's just thaw the meatloaf and eat meatloaf here. And we were like, but Grandma, we want to take you out. And she could not see the point of, why would you go pay all this money to have somebody else serve you when you're capable of doing it yourself? She felt the same way about clothes. Like, why go buy clothes? You can make them. Why go buy vegetables? You can grow them. And so she was this very DIY kind of person. And a lot of people in America back then were like, why pay somebody else all this extra money to serve you when you can do it yourself? But today we're people that we always pay somebody else to do it. We love to just go spend money on things we don't need and don't really want after a few days anyway. And so we're always, what in my grandma's mind, wasting money on things that we don't really need to be wasting our money on. And so that's what we mean by consumerism. And remember, America was a country founded by Puritans. The Puritans, the Pilgrims that came over on the Mayflower, they were very, what we could call abstemious people. They abstained. They didn't go spend their money on stuff. They didn't wear a lot of jewelry or any. They didn't wear fancy clothes. They all wore black and white. And they all had this very strict idea that you're here on earth to serve God. So you shouldn't be calling attention to yourself and your own glory. You should be doing everything you can to serve God. Well, that's who the colonists who founded America. But now we're a country that's the opposite of that. We're like, it's all about partying and having fun and going out and spending your money on your bling and showing off all the stuff you have. So how did we go from being a society where you don't waste your money and don't show off to being a society where that's all we seem to be about? And now we like show off to ourselves with selfies and stuff like that. And so we've become very consumerist. And how did that happen? Well, advertising and movies and TV and magazines and all kinds of things began to be created to train people, to basically persuade people in America that you're not happy unless you're buying stuff, that you're not cool enough, you're not sexy enough, you're not doing enough exciting things, you are boring, you're a nerd. I mean, there's all these ways that are advertising. And by the way, it isn't just entertainment. Like you go see the movies, and part of the goal of consumerism is where the entertainment itself doesn't just entertain you, it also trains you to be a consumer. Like the movies too have pictures of nice cars and nice clothes and nice jewelry. And I'm thinking especially of the movies in the 1930s when people were first starting to be turned into consumers, away from being savers who save their money and don't show off, to being people that want to buy all this stuff. Well, the movies and TV and radio were purposely designed with shows that made you want to buy stuff. And what came on between the shows were commercials selling you the stuff. And so Americans were taught to be consumers, people that want to spend their money. And that's what keeps the system going. As long as you hate your job, you might suck at, you might think your job sucks, you might wish you got paid more, and all day long you're mad at your boss. But what keeps you from joining a revolutionary movement to go overthrow capitalism is you say, well, I get to go to the movies later. I can't wait to get off work so I can go to the movies, or I can't wait to get off work so I can go play my video games. And as long as you're playing video games and shooting zombies in your video game, you're not going to a political rally and demanding political change in your society, or demanding better wages for workers or shorter hours or things like that. So it's a very nice system for capitalists in that they work you all day and don't pay you very much. And those same capitalists that own the factory where you work might also own the movie theater where you go spend that little money you had all day. And they might also own the video game company and stuff. So the very same capitalists that made you unhappy with your life to begin with are also the ones making the money off the fact that you're unhappy with your life and you're trying to make things happy with consumerism. So it's a very nice system for capitalism. It's you exploit the worker all day and then you pay him some money, but then he pays it right back to you at the end of the day when he gets off the job and goes to the movies or goes to the video store. And so, but that keeps the system going because people, as long as they're happy with their leisure time, with their time off work and their time on the weekends, then they probably aren't going to revolt and overthrow the system. So long term, that's been the strategy for capitalism, is to make people to create a consumer society where people are happy to go to work because they want to earn the money that they can use to buy the products. But that's not a short-term strategy. In terms of pulling us out of the Great Depression, something more immediate needed to be done. One thing was the New Deal. The New Deal is a name for a set of programs that the president at the time. So a socialist didn't run for president in 1932. Herbert Hoover was the president at the time, and he was very much a capitalist, and a lot of people were very angry at Hoover, and they blamed him for a lot of the poverty people were facing. Roosevelt ran for president, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and he got elected saying, I'm going to give a new deal to Americans. And the new deal is kind of between capital and labor. Instead of conflict, which is what they were facing, Roosevelt was trying to say we need a new deal between the owners of factories and land and the workers who work in them, and a new deal between the American government and the people who are in it. And so the first thing that the New Deal promised was that the government would be the referee. In the conflict between capital or capitalists and labor. Marx is a conflict theorist. He's pointing out that capitalism as a system creates this conflict where the gains of the capitalist are at the expense of the worker, of labor. And what Roosevelt proposed was, well, if the government could kind of regulate this fight a little bit more, just like a boxing match, you don't just let the boxers do whatever you want to each other. They're not allowed to like bite each other or reach around and punch the guy in the kidney or punch the guy in the privates. A boxing match has a referee to make sure it's a fair fight. And Roosevelt basically said, we need a fair fight between the working people and the capitalists. And it's not fair if the capitalists have all the power and the workers are totally dependent on them. Workers need a little power too. And so what does that mean? The government, and by the way, the conflict that was going on was quite violent at times. Workers would try to form unions, for example, because unions are one way for workers to have some power against the capitalist. If I go in by myself asking for a raise, he's probably not going to give it to me. But if we all go in with our arms linked and say we need a raise, like, by the way, the Yuba City teachers are going to do tomorrow. They're going to go on strike and say, you better give us a raise. But hopefully it's not going to be violent. It's a peaceful demonstration because they have a union. But before there were unions, if you didn't have a union and you wanted a raise, what kind of leverage could you use on your boss? Well, you could say to some fellow workers, hey, tonight, let's go to the factory and burn it down. And if the factory burns down, the boss is going to start waking up like, some people are burning down my factory. And the worker's like, we don't know how that happened, boss. That sucks. You know, in other words, it's a way of trying to get some leverage on the boss. And if he doesn't want his factories burning down, maybe he would think about giving a raise to some of the workers there. So there were things like that, workers getting together to vandalize factories or vandalize the machines. On the other hand, companies were organizing, I don't know if you ever heard of Pinkerton Detectives, but the Pinkerton Detective Group started out as basically armed thugs that when guys were starting to form a union, they sent out the Pinkertons and we don't know how it happened, but a bunch of workers wound up dead last night. They were starting to form a union. Maybe that had something to do with it, but we don't know what happened. Well, the companies were hiring guys to go kill people that were trying to... So it's literal warfare between capitalists who don't want workers making more wages and workers who need better wages, trying to use violence to get it. And if you're the president of a country like Roosevelt, you're saying, I can't have violence between the people who own factories and the people who work in factories. We need products made in America, but we need everybody happy with it. So how are we going to get that? So he said, well, we need to sit down like gentlemen at a table. There is conflict between people. But instead of fighting it out with violence and murder, why don't we sit like gentlemen at a negotiating table and figure out, well, what is a fair profit for you to be making? What's a fair profit, a fair wage for workers to be making? How can we come to terms where you're getting a fair profit and the workers is getting a fair wage? And the idea was you can do that with unions. So one of the things this New Deal said was workers have a right to have a union. But it was under very strict rules, with strict rules. So the strict rules say things like, if you're the Yuba City teachers, you can't just call a strike today. You can't just say, we're not working today. You better pay us more. We're not coming to work today. That's not fair. That creates havoc and chaos, and parents and kids and everyone's affected. So the union rules say if you have a union and you want a better wage, the first thing you do is strike. You have a bunch of steps you have to follow. And you have to take a vote on whether people want to strike. And you have to call for a strike. And you have to notify your managers that you might be going on strike. And there's all these rules you have to follow. It used to be called a wildcat strike. A wildcat strike is when just one day the boss shows up and all the workers are sitting down going, we're not going to work today, boss. You better change our wages. And obviously bosses don't like that. And Roosevelt said, well, we can't have that, but workers should be able to it's called collective bargaining. We should be able to go in together as a group and bargain for better wages and better conditions. Because when we go in by ourselves, we never get what we ask for. But if we go in as a group, we can get what we need. And so we should be allowed to go in as a group. And the New Deal included some new laws that made it possible. But it also meant this deal, yes, workers are getting something, but bosses are getting something too, because what Roosevelt is saying to the companies is, well, now you don't need to worry about wildcat strikes, people just not working. You don't need to worry about your factories getting burned down in the middle of the night. We're going to handle this all in a peaceful way. So the workers are going to have unions, but that means when you have conflict, you're going to go to a bargaining table and you're going to sit down with lawyers on both sides and you're going to figure out what the fair contract should be. And if you can't come to terms, there's other steps that can be taken. But the point is that we need to work out the conflict peacefully and work it out with the understanding that when companies do well, one thing Roosevelt liked to say was, a rising tide lifts all ships. So he meant when our companies, like General Motors was the biggest company at the time, and another thing Roosevelt said is, what's good for General Motors is good for America, he said. So he was trying to say, if we can help General Motors make cars, sell cars, and help their workers be happy, and help their investors be happy, then all of America benefits from that. So that was this New Deal, was the government is going to regulate capitalism and be kind of the referee that makes sure workers are treated well, make sure companies are treated well, make sure both sides, when they do have conflict, that it's handled in a peaceful, negotiated way. And so companies stood to gain a lot more peace, a lot less worry about the future, and workers were gaining a lot. And by the way, as Roosevelt pointed out, when workers will get paid more if they have unions. They're going to be able to demand better wages, and so your profits might go down in that sense, you companies, but really your profits are going to go up because the more workers are being treated well and have money to spend, the more money they're going to be using to consume things. So all these companies are going to be able to sell their products now because workers are going to be well treated. So that was a big part of saving capitalism, was redesigning it as something that's more fair, where both sides have power. If the capitalists have all the power and the workers have none, it's a polarized, unbalanced society. Roosevelt also saw the value of public employment, and that was part of the New Deal, was to say we need to employ, the government can employ people. There's things that need doing that business doesn't want to do because it's not profitable, but government needs it done. Can you think of something government might need getting done that private businesses wouldn't want to do because they couldn't make money at it, but the government?
Trash.
Well, trash, for example, might not be all that profitable. Bridges, building bridges, for example. Bridges cost a lot of money to build. It takes a long time before they recoup their money. So even if you charge people like $10 to cross the bridge, it's going to take a lot of people crossing that bridge before the bridge pays itself off. So that's why companies, private companies, doesn't look like a good investment. I mean, I'm going to spend $2 billion building your bridge, and it's going to be like 40 years before we see a profit on that. So they say no to bridges. But communities need bridges. And all the community, like around here, I would say, if you've ever tried to go over to Yuba City at like after 3 p.m. on any day, you start to feel like maybe we need another bridge going from Marysville to Yuba City. Well, nobody wants to build that bridge because they can't make money off it. And the government has no money to build a bridge, so it's not getting built. But that's an example of what's called infrastructure. There was something called the Public Works, the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, that hired people. A lot of people were out of work because of the Great Depression, and the WPA built what were called public works. Public works include things like bridges. And what else? Do you know there are things in Marysville that were built during the 1930s by Roosevelt's WPA? Well, Ellis Lake, the whole Ellis Lake Park and that whole thing was a project of the Works Projects Administration, which said, well, we got a lot of unemployed workers. We also have a need for parks because a lot of poor people in America don't have backyards and a place for their kids to play. So let's kill two birds with one stone. Let's build a big park and hire a bunch of out-of-work workers to lay all the stonework around the lake and things like that. Another benefit of that lake was, I think it helped with flood control. So another problem you had was flooding of the town. And if you have a big man-made lake in the middle of the town, you have a place for flood control. So a lot of good ideas being put into service there where the government is creating the work and creating the job. I'm mentioning this because that's another debate we're having as a society now today. Who can create jobs? Is it the government or is it business? And the Republicans like to say government doesn't create jobs, but it's not true. There are many times when the government has created jobs because there's many things governments need getting done. It's true that governments invest taxpayers' money, but anyway, so public works. But another one would be like the Tower Bridge in Sacramento, big golden bridge, got built by the WPA. The Golden Gate Bridge, one of the most beautiful bridges on planet Earth, was built by the WPA. And so there again, I mentioned that because again, what you hear a lot today in America, especially around Yuba County, is government's not capable of doing anything right. You wouldn't trust government to do anything. Well, they built Golden Gate Bridge, which is still considered one of the most beautiful bridges. They built Tower Bridge, which is still the symbol of Sacramento. And Hoover Dam, a big, huge dam in Nevada that powers Las Vegas. You couldn't have Las Vegas without this public works that was built by the WPA during the Great Depression. And right now is a time when a lot of people are out of work in America. And in fact, President Obama said we need a lot of infrastructure. We have a lot of crumbling bridges, a lot of crumbling roads, a lot of crumbling sewers, a lot of crumbling public parks and things, and state parks and national parks. We should have unemployed workers be hired to go do those things. Well, in this case, the Republicans said no, and that didn't really happen all that much. But back then, a lot of people were put to work. The war, too, World War II, was another place. Wars are something governments like to do that private businesses might benefit from, but they don't have the capacity to start a war. But governments can, and they can put people to work. And that was those things helped end the Great Depression and save capitalism in a way. But another point we need to make is the social safety net. That's one of the main things we remember the New Deal for nowadays, is to say, well, what we realized at that time is capitalism is a very cruel, can be a cold and cruel system. There's something called the business cycle. The business cycle means there's booms and busts in capitalism. There's boom and bust cycle in capitalism. So there's times when lots of products are getting made and getting sold and companies are making a lot of profit, and there's other times when the opposite is happening. And the Great Depression was one of those terrible busts. So like the Great Depression is down here. The Roaring 20s is over here. So the Roaring 20s, 1920s, a lot of money was being made apparently in America. But the 1930s was a bust time. And that naturally happens with capitalism. So Roosevelt said, well, when those busts happen, it isn't workers' fault if they lose their jobs. Like when I came to you and said, sorry, I'm going to have to lay half of you off because our chairs aren't selling. It wasn't your fault that the chairs weren't selling. You were doing you were doing great work. You were being very productive. But I had to lay you off because they weren't selling. And that means, should you just end up on the street? Should you end up starving and your kids starving because you got laid off? Well, in traditional capitalism, yes. But in this New Deal capitalism, the idea was, no, you shouldn't have to just end up starving on the street because you lost your job. There should be, for example, when we talk about the social safety net, what are we talking about? What do you think I'm talking about? What are some things that we now have in place that catch a worker when you fall? If you lose your job and you're on the street, you don't end up on the street right away necessarily. Where do you end up?
Unemployment, social services.
Social Security. So things like, so when we talk about the social safety net, what are the things we're talking about? I'm listing them now. So you can have social safety net. Unemployment insurance was one of the first things, the idea that you'll pay a little bit of money out of your paycheck each month into this fund. And then if you lose your job, you have this fund to draw on. So you can still get a paycheck even if you don't have a job because of unemployment insurance. And that became a new idea during the New Deal. Welfare was another idea. That was, well, what if I can't work? What if I'm a single mom and my husband died in the war? You know, who's going to take care of me and my children? And welfare said, well, we have a system in place for that. If I get too sick to work, or I get injured and I can't work, there was a system for that. Social Security, you can get a guaranteed income, even if you can't work. Eventually, Medicare was added and Medicaid in the 60s, but immediately in the 30s was when these things got put into place. And Obamacare, you could say, was an attempt to expand the social safety net, although a lot of people are unsure about that one. But if anything, the social safety net is not today where it used to be, and we'll talk about that later. But that was one of the great insights of the New Deal, was you can make capitalism a kinder, gentler system that people are happier in if it doesn't lead to total misery when the system has a downturn. There's a final piece, a most important piece of saving capitalism that I'll explain later, but maybe you want to write it down now, and that is to grow the middle class. One of the big ideas of saving capitalism was, well, if we do have a have and have-not society, that isn't very stable. It would be better to have a have-some society. Have a lot of people in the middle that aren't have-nots but aren't quite the have capitalists. And if we can grow that group of people, then we'll have a more stable society. So we'll talk about how that was done and later on. But anyway, we'll see you next week.